Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Ethic Ocean webinar. I'm just sharing my screen quickly. And full screen while you're logging in. Taking a bit of time. It is not going full screen. Well, we will just run with that. So good morning or good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lotta Pirttimaa. I'm a Senior Policy Officer at Ocean Energy Europe, and we coordinate the European Technology and Innovation Platform for Ocean Energy, ETIP Ocean, that aims at sharing knowledge across the world, really, on ocean energy and help to promote the development of the sector that way. And today we have a webinar on resources and tools for faster permitting of ocean energy. So looking at all the different material that can be found, because, for example, to give you a bit of context, now the EU is really driving for faster permitting for all renewables, in some cases to even 1 year to get projects on the ground or in the water. And in order to get there, we really need to have enough information for both project developers, but also to permitting authorities, regulators. So for ocean energy, these resources and tools really exist already. So in this webinar, we really want to show and talk about what kind of material is available. So if I'm going to the next slide, there we go. So today I'm happy to welcome our speakers, Andrea Copping, a Senior Manager, and Michaela Freeman, Marine Science and Policy Analyst, both from Pacific Northwest National Laboratory and in the context of OES-Environmental, which Andrea will talk about in just a minute. And I will walk through a few of the concepts, tools, materials that OES-Environmental has been working on and has prepared, and is also available, freely accessible on the internet, so you can go and take a look at them as well. With that, I'll just stop sharing and hand it over to first Andrea. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Lotta. And now you have the note view right now, Michaela. We're very pleased to be here today. We'll just get the slides sorted in a second.
Sorry, 1 second. There we go. Okay. How's that?
Perfect. Wonderful. Thank you. Well, good afternoon or good morning to everyone. We're very pleased to be here today to talk with the ETIP interested group. What we are going to talk about is really how we take the science that has been going on in this field and really apply it to consenting or permitting. What are the resources available that look at environmental effects of marine energy, and how do we use them in a practical sense? As Lotta said, my name is Andrea Copping, and I'm here with my colleague Michaela Freeman. We are both with Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, one of the U.S. Department of Energy's national laboratories in the U.S. But we also represent Ocean Energy Systems Environmental, or OES-Environmental. Next slide, please, Michaela. Excuse me. Today, we're going to do a quick overview of what OES-Environmental is. We'll really start to hone in on this idea of how you move from science to consenting. And that's really the sort of the meat of this webinar. And Michaela's going to talk about the key processes we've been working on: risk retirement, data transferability, also touch on adaptive management. We'll touch on the sort of future-looking work we're doing around systems, and end with some examples of good practices and lessons learned in applying some of these processes and principles. Next slide, please. So OES-Environmental, I'm sure many of you on the line have heard me say this before, but we're going to do it again. Ocean Energy Systems, of course, is one of the committees of 25 plus nations under the International Energy Agency's technology collaboration. And OES-Environmental is a task that has been initiated by Ocean Energy Systems. We started in 2010, so we've been going quite a while. We are authorized in 4-year phases, and we are just coming down towards the end of phase 4. The purpose of OES-Environmental is to examine environmental effects for the marine energy industry, with the idea of helping to smooth the way towards consenting and licensing, and therefore advance the industry. This particular task is led by the US, and our partners in Washington, D.C., the US Department of Energy, are the leads. We at Pacific Northwest National Lab implement the task. I am the operating agent and responsible to OES. This phase, we have 16 countries, which is wonderful, and you see them represented there by the flags. At the end of each 4-year phase, we produce a fairly comprehensive document called the State of the Science Report that brings together really all existing information that is accessible. And this is the cover here of the 2020 report, and we are already deep into the preparation of the 2024 State of the Science. That will be released in May of 2024 as a draft for comment, and the final released in September of 2024. And you can find out more. You'll see these URLs on many of our slides where you can go and find out more information on our TETHIS website. Next slide, please. Okay, so marine renewable energy, we all know why we're here. This is the energy harvested from waves, tides, currents, ocean gradients, though most of us, I think, admittedly work on wave and tidal energy. We know we're in the early stages of development and deployment and commercialization, and that an uncertainty around environmental effects is a key factor that's slowing permitting. So we have tried to address this through a framework of stressors and receptors. And over a decade of work has really brought it to these 7 stressors that you see in the lower right-hand corner as the little round icons. Collision risk, of course, applies largely to tidal energy, where you have animals with the potential to run into operating blades. Underwater noise is applicable to both wave energy, tidal, and others. And the concern there particularly is disrupting marine mammals and fish navigation or communication. Electromagnetic fields emanating from export cables and some energized devices can affect certain sensitive species. We are concerned about changes in both benthic and pelagic habitat and how that affects the organisms. There are concerns that large marine animals could become entangled in mooring lines and cables. We don't really think this is much of a concern, but it's brought up by stakeholders on a frequent basis. Changes in oceanographic systems, changes in wave heights and periods, and changes in circulation can occur. And the last one, displacement, is the one we've looked at the least, because this is really dependent on having many devices out there, arrays that could interrupt animal migration or movement. And obviously we don't have that many in the water just yet. But this is really the way in which we think about these things. Next slide, please. So the heart of this really is there's been a lot of scientific research going on for really close to 2 decades now. Studies that range from animal behavior to changes in habitat, laboratory experiments, numerical modeling, and so on. But we know that regulators and advisors often don't have the time or perhaps the training to read the scientific papers. So things like the State of the Science and some of the derivative products we produce, we hope can help with that. But we feel the need to go a step further and really try to put this information into the regulatory context using the proper formats, approaches, and tools that make it accessible and interrelatable. And that right-hand big circle is just sort of pictures of some of those. And that's really the heart of what we're going to talk about today. And in order to do that, I'm going to turn it over to Michaela, who's really going to walk you through a number of these, let you know about their accessibility. So, Michaela.
Thanks, Andrea. So as Andrea mentioned, I'm going to go over a lot of information, kind of high level, but on each of the slides, we do have links to access more information, and I will point you to that when those are available. So first, I'm going to start out with a concept called risk retirement. And this we really developed after hearing the need to provide mechanisms to transfer existing marine renewable energy or MRE data and information to new projects, and also to understand uncertainties to guide research and assess that risk. So as Andrea mentioned, taking the information and trying to actually apply it. So by risk retirement, I mean that for certain interactions, potential risks may not need to be fully investigated for every project. And when I say this, we're really talking about small numbers of devices, about 1 to 4, which is most of the deployments that we've seen to date. So instead, we can really rely on what's already known from consented projects, from research, and from analogous industries. And we can use data transferability to inform this as well. And I'll dive into a little bit more detail that in a few slides. Two really important things to note here is that a risk or a retired risk can be re-examined in the future if new information arises, or as the industry is scaling up to a raise, we may need to re-examine what that risk looks like when you have more than 4 devices in the water. And that risk retirement doesn't replace or contradict any regulatory processes in a particular country or jurisdiction. The development of this concept has really been an iterative process, kind of shown by this diagram here on the left. We've gathered feedback along the way from the marine renewable energy community, regulators, advisors, through workshops, through webinars, surveys, and also reviews of draft documents. Again, I won't go into too much detail, so if you're interested, you can visit the TETHIS link here at the bottom. And there's a recording of past webinars where we go into more detail on risk retirement and some of these other processes and resources that I'll mention throughout the presentation. So just to acquaint kind of what I'll walk through today, in this gray circle, we have the risk retirement pathway up at the top, shown in that kind of orange, blue, purple, green diagram. And that's how we apply risk retirement through processes and identify and assess information. Those icons that you'll see throughout this presentation, Andrea already introduced us to, note the different stressor receptor interactions that we've looked at as far as how we can assess risk retirement, and I'll talk more about that in the next slide. And then I'll talk about guidance documents, again, as a way to apply risk retirement and provide that framework. Up in the blue circle is data transferability, and really key to this process is being able to transfer data, but also having consistent data that can be applied and be compared across marine renewable energy deployments and across the industry. So with that, as I mentioned, we tried to assess risk and take the information that we have and see how we can apply it to these stressor receptor interactions. So to identify the potential interactions that may be ripe for risk retirement, we developed what's called evidence bases. And these compile key research papers, monitoring reports, and different documents to inform risk retirement. They've so far been compiled for 6 interactions, which I've noted here with those icons, and then also listed out. And you can see the number of documents that we have available for each of those interactions within the evidence base. And again, a link to the evidence base down in the bottom here. Once the evidence bases for the potential risks were gathered, we assessed the data and information and the potential to retire the risk. We described how it can be applied to new projects as well. Each of these was reviewed and discussed by experts through international conferences and online workshops, as well as expert consultation. And through these, based on the information compiled and the review and discussion with experts, there was agreement that we can consider 4 of these risks retired. And these are the first 4 that we started off with. And so these are electromagnetic fields, or EMF, underwater noise, habitat change, and changes in oceanographic system. As Andrea mentioned, we think risk from entanglement will be minimal due to taut lines for most MRE deployments, but more information is needed to inform collision risk. So that's why those are in italics there. We do need more information, and we haven't yet taken that step to look at we've looked at can this risk retire, but we're not yet there to fully say that. So all the evidence bases, again, can be found on THESIS here. And if you're interested in more information on that process and how we got to saying we can retire these risks for small numbers of devices, we have recorded webinars from 2020 and 2021 that do go into more detail presenting those evidence bases for those interactions. So as I mentioned, a major component of risk retirement is the ability to use what we know to inform future projects. And we believe that data and information collected through research studies and monitoring from other projects should inform new projects. We do acknowledge that there will be a level of site-specific data collection needed for all new projects, but that data from MRE projects as well as analogous industries can both inform new MRE projects and reduce site-specific data collection needs. Again, important to note that to transfer data, it needs to be collected consistently and assessed for comparison. And to help us do that, we developed a monitoring datasets discoverability matrix. It is a bit of a mouthful of a title, but after talking with regulators and advisors about the ability to transfer data to aid permitting and consenting, and continuing to hear that there was really a need to easily find and access data that could be transferred and applied for marine renewable energy projects. The matrix is an interactive online tool to guide this data transfer as it makes data sets from existing projects accessible and easily identifiable. And it does so as it's categorized by 6 interactions: collision risk, underwater noise, EMF, habitat change, oceanographic systems, and displacement. And it also identifies characteristics to help easily find relevant data. And so each set of characteristics is really specific to that interaction, but it generally includes the stressor, the receptor, site condition, technology type, and project size. The data sets included in the matrix come from OES-Environmental metadata forms, which capture information on environmental effects from marine renewable energy project sites and active research studies, as well as key documents from the evidence base. And really, this tool is allowing users to choose an interaction and define characteristics based on data needs for a future project, and provides results that are relevant for regulators trying to consent or developers aiming to submit an application. And again, finding that comparable information to transfer. So with these tools and resources, we really wanted to be able to bring them together to aid consenting processes. So we started to develop what we call guidance documents for risk retirement. These were developed for regulators consenting and licensing projects, for advisors who are assessing the information and informing regulators, and developers as they're preparing those fit-for-purpose applications. Each component is really designed to move from scientific evidence to application within a regulatory context, making information as well as resources and tools accessible and readily available. The guidance documents themselves are intended to be broadly applicable across the international marine renewable energy industry. And again, I'll just say it's important to note that the guidance documents don't replace any regulation or national guidance, but are meant to be a useful tool. So there are 3 aspects of the guidance document that I'll go over briefly and then in more detail in the next few slides. First is a background document that provides the context for this effort. It explains the purpose and application of information, a description of regulatory categories, and a framework for application. Then we have the country-specific documents, which are being developed for each of the participating OES-Environmental countries by the country representatives. And then we have stressor-specific guidance documents that present an overview of the different stressor receptor interactions. And in the next slide, again, I'll walk through these. The URL to find access to all of this information on the guidance documents can be found in the link in the below corner, and you can navigate to the different pieces of the guidance document from that link. So as I mentioned, the guidance documents use 4 regulatory categories, and this is the basis of moving between scientific evidence and application for consenting and licensing. We as the MRA community tends to talk about stressor receptor interactions, but the regulatory community has responsibilities governed by legislation and regulations, and therefore we really try to categorize what those are and map them to the different stressor receptor interactions. So we've mapped those to 4 categories that we've discussed with our different country representatives, again, trying to make this internationally applicable, as well as regulators and advisors. And we think that these fit well and are applicable across the board. So the 4 categories are species and populations at risk. So we're talking endangered, threatened, and vulnerable species, economically valuable species, and culturally significant species. And the next is habitat alteration or loss. So essential, critical, or vulnerable habitats and larger protected ecosystems. The third is effects on water quality. So changes in water circulation, wave heights, and current speeds. And then the last is effects on social and economic systems. So economic effects such as gross value added, employment opportunities, and social effects such as services, health and well-being, and general community impacts. So the background document provides a description of each of these categories, as well as relevant information for consenting processes, such as baseline information needs and potential risks for each of these categories, again, mapping those stressor receptor interactions to each of these. It also includes information on risk retirement within each of these 4 categories and a brief notes on caveats as well as cumulative effects. So within this background document, we've also developed a framework to show the application of the guidance documents within consenting processes. Many of you are likely familiar with what we've laid out here in the framework, but it identifies the different aspects of the consenting process, including who's responsible for each step. And we've also noted throughout the framework where these concepts such as risk retirement and data transferability can be used. On this slide, I'm showing a very condensed, simplified version due to time constraints today, but this is a much larger, detailed framework, so I do recommend taking a look at the background document and see the full version. Overall, we really aim to make this framework applicable internationally and use language that's relevant across countries. So it's a simplified version of consenting processes, but we do hope that it includes enough detail to guide users through the application of these concepts from project scoping to the end of project licensing. So the next part of the guidance documents I want to highlight are the country-specific documents. As I mentioned, the goal is to develop these for each of the OES-Environmental countries, working with the country representatives to do so. The documents include information on regulatory jurisdictions, agencies, or regulatory bodies with jurisdiction over marine renewable energy projects, key regulations and statutes for environmental effects based on those 4 regulatory categories, and then additional relevant information such as on marine spatial planning or adaptive management. And I do want to note that these documents are not meant to be comprehensive. They're really meant to be kind of a short form document that provides an overview of jurisdictions, regulations, can help guide a developer who's putting a project in the water, but ultimately links to where you can find more information. So the last piece of the guidance documents are the stressor-specific documents, which bring together current knowledge on these stressor receptor interactions to make the data and information easily accessible, again, trying to aim at those short format documents. So far, we've developed stressor documents for 4 interactions: underwater noise, EMF, habitat change, changes in oceanographic systems, as well as collision and entanglement. Those will be available online actually later today. So we've just been able to add them recently. Each document includes background information on the interaction. It links to existing data and information, so that's easily accessible. It includes some information on the pathway to risk retirement and where we think we are there, and then some recommendations as well. So now that I've gone over the different components, I wanted to show the progress on the development of these guidance documents to date and kind of situate them all together. So we've completed the background document shown by the yellow check marks you'll see here, as well as all those stressor-specific documents. As I mentioned, collision and entanglement will be available later on TPIS today. And then in the green, we've worked with our OES-Environmental country representatives, and we have several documents completed already, and then shown by the navy blue gears, we have a few that should be available soon, and we'll continue to work with our other country representatives to get all of those up online. All right, so switching gears a little bit, in addition to risk retirement and data transferability to aid consenting and moving the marine renewable energy industry forward, adaptive management or learning by doing is also really key. Adaptive management is a structured, iterative process that really aims to reduce scientific uncertainty and improve management decisions, as you can kind of see in this diagram to the right here. The process begins by assessing a potential problem or concern, identifying uncertainties and needs, monitoring to increase our understanding, evaluating what those monitoring outcomes are, and then adjusting monitoring or project details as needed. And adaptive management has really been key in moving several marine renewable energy projects processes forward for single devices and small arrays. And you'll hear a little bit more about that from Andrea in a bit. So with this, OES-Environmental created a management measures tool, which compiles management measures that have been used and tried for current and previous marine renewable energy projects. By management measures, or sometimes referred to as mitigation measures, we mean actions that are taken to help address those potential impacts of marine renewable energy projects that can be applied at different steps in the development process. So within this tool, management measures are related to compliance, to design features, to mitigation, or to monitoring. And the tool allows users to search for available information. You can filter by categories or by keyword, and you can also download the information as well as additional information that's not shown in the online tool that can then be applied to future projects to help manage those uncertainties or potential concerns. The tool was created in 2017, but last year we did a bit of an overhaul of the tool to provide updates and include additional information from marine renewable energy projects that have been developed since 2017, and also to make improvements to the tool generally for user experience and everything. And we do plan to keep this tool updated and provide updates to the tool every 6 months or so. We did recently hold a webinar where I provided a more in-depth overview and demonstration of the tool. And so again, I'll direct you to the link on this slide where you can find the tool itself. And there's also a link to that webinar if you do want to see a bit of more of a demonstration of this. So the last thing I want to mention, which Andrea talked a little bit about, is as the industry progresses, a holistic approach and look at potential systems effects is really needed. To do so, OES-Environmental has been exploring 3 new focus areas over the last year or so. And I won't go into detail on these, but I did want to quickly mention them as they're really important to understand for the industry. And we're starting to see these considerations more and more. So the 3 areas that we've been exploring are scaling up of effects of marine energy from single devices to large arrays, the cumulative effects of marine renewable energy with other anthropogenic stressors and activities at sea, and the ecosystem effects of marine renewable energy, including ecosystem services and what we call an ecosystem approach. So working with our OES-Environmental country representatives and experts in the industry, white papers have been written to describe each topic, detail methods for assessing each of these, and describe their application for MRE projects. Journal manuscripts will be coming soon. And with that, I will pass it off to Andrea, and she'll kind of pull together these concepts and show how they've been applied across the MRE industry to aid consenting processes.
Thank you, Michaela. So I want to end up this webinar with a few examples where some of these tools and processes have been applied. Now, we think there are many more examples, but it's often very difficult to see when a project gets through a consenting process or not, exactly what the reasons were. So I just want to point out 3 from the US, 2 from the UK, where we think there's a fairly clear line of sight to what some of the tools that were applied moved the process forward in a regulatory sense. So next slide, please. The first example, and we consider these to be good practices and lessons learned, this one is really around the stressor receptor interactions framework. PacWave is going to be the United States' first grid-connected wave energy test center. It's in the Pacific off the coast of Oregon, it's almost ready to be commissioned happily, but it took 10 years to consent that process, as you can see there. They have the cables laid and they hope to be actually in operation testing by next year. When this consenting process started, they really tried to focus on the devices and the systems that could be tested there. And they found that very difficult to define within a regulatory process, partly because it's not clear exactly what devices, what effects they might have on the environment, and so on. And progress towards regulatory acceptance was very slow. There was a change made, a shift to looking at specific environmental concerns using this stressor receptor relationship. What part of underwater noise might affect which protected species, what part of EMF should we be concerned about, and so on. And this allowed for much more efficient addressing of the concerns, and they were really able to move forward and get a consent and licensing, even though there was still significant uncertainty. And Michaela and her colleagues have actually written a paper on that. You can find some of that on TETHIS. Our next example, next slide, please, is again good practices and lessons learned, but where there was a direct application of the risk retirement idea. Moving to the Atlantic, Verdant Power has been testing their devices, which you see over on the right hand side of the picture there, since about 2012. They are in the East River of New York, which is right in the middle of New York City, right beside Manhattan at the Roosevelt Island Tidal Energy Project. And they have deployed, back in 2012, they deployed 3 of these devices on a frame. And the biggest concern environmentally there was collision risk with 2 endangered species, Atlantic salmon and Atlantic sturgeon. There was extensive research studies done around those initial small turbines with using telemetry, active acoustics to track fish movement. There was hydrodynamic modeling done to understand fish responses, and an encounter probability model specific to this area and those fish were created. Based on all of that work, the regulators decided there was very little evidence there was going to be harm to these fish. And so for subsequent deployments in the river, of which there were several, the last one just came out about a year ago, they decided that the risk of collision to fish was small enough they could retire that risk and it no longer needed to be addressed. And information about this can be found both on Verdant's site, but also on TETHIS. Our next example also comes from the US. We consider this a good practice and lessons learned around adaptive management. The Ocean Renewable Power Company, ORPC, is again in the Atlantic up north towards right near the border with Canada in Cobb's Cook Bay, Maine. And they have deployed this cross flow turbine. You see over on the right, you see 4 turbine units on a frame. And that needed to be piled into the seafloor. And in order to get the necessary consenting and the licensing, they needed to go through a process to ensure a number of different issues, including collision risk and so on, but starting with the concerns around pile driving, the noise, the disruption, and so on. And they did this in very effectively through an adaptive management process. They have an adaptive management committee that meets at least annually, and it's made up of the regulatory agencies, all the relevant stakeholders, including the developer and the local communities. And the adaptive management approach here is to look at the data that have been collected, to understand what it's telling them, what's telling the group, to decide whether that data collection effort should be dialed up or dialed back, and apply that. And by doing this monitoring and science-based decision-making, the 2 big concerns was again around Atlantic salmon, and this had put seasonal restrictions for pile driving on when the fish were not present or were not migrating. And there was also concern for marine mammals, which required the round-the-clock use of marine mammal observers while piling was going on, which meant often that they could not work at night. So with this adaptive management approach and significant monitoring, they were able to remove both of those requirements so that they could pile drive around throughout the year at any necessary time, and also around the clock by removing the marine mammal observers. And this really led to quicker installation and adjustments of the frame on the bottom. Same thing when they removed it, and really moved this forward more quickly. And again, ORPC's website as well as TETHIS has more details. Okay, moving to the UK for a couple of lessons. In this case, the good lesson and good practice and lessons learned is around data transferability. Sustainable Marine Energy, SME, deployed their first Plato 1 off Yarmouth, England, down towards the south in 2016. Again, there was a whole series of studies around a lot of stressor receptor relationships, but starting again with the installation, where there was concern that the noise would affect marine mammals, also basking sharks. They collected extensive data, and when SME moved to the European Marine Energy Centre, EMAC, up in Scotland, they were able to directly apply those data for the consenting process, which made it very, very swift and efficient. The specifics around the installation is they could remove the marine mammal observers that were needed whenever the device was going in the water. This is a single wing device with turbines that are lowered down, and they had previously needed marine mammal observers every time they moved the turbines. So this really was a means of decreasing costs, keeping fewer personnel offshore for safety reasons, and so on. And again, more details on Marine Scotland site and also on TETHIS. And our final example of good practices and lessons learned is scaling to arrays. I think all of us are aware of the Machen project up in Pentland Firth to the north of Scotland, so between Scotland and the Orkney Islands. And Seamus Atlantis have been working on this project for quite some time, since 2010. It remains the largest commercial tidal array in the world. They are currently consented for up to 86 megawatts. These are approximately 1 megawatt turbines, so 86 turbines. And their seabed lease would actually allow them to go up to almost 400 turbines. However, they have only been able to install and have that consent move forward in a phased manner, having to solve the major environmental problems at each phase in order to move forward. Currently, 6 turbines are installed and operating for phase 1. And the biggest concern has been collision risk of marine mammals and fish. So there's been extensive work monitoring research studies around these turbines, including research on marine animal behavior and interactions. And to date, over quite a period of time of years, there's been no collision or other direct detectable impacts due to the turbines, which suggests that although not impossible, it is unlikely that there will be such interactions or collisions. And it is this continued data that is allowing the regulator the confidence to move forward to the next phase. So we hope to see up to 28 operating turbines by 2027. Scotland has put in place what they call their survey, deploy, and monitor approach, which is get things in the water, look at them, and decide what to do next. And this is really a perfect example where they are applying that to try to move forward from small numbers of devices up towards commercial devices, past that so-called valley of death. And okay, so next slide to wrap up here. So those are just some examples of where we think these are being applied. We do think there's many more examples, and we're always looking for good examples if anyone has a good story there. So to wrap this up, the point of OES-Environmental is to really move the industry forward. And the biggest thing that is holding us back, in my opinion, is that we don't have enough devices in the water with which we can collect data, test hypotheses, and validate the numerical models we've been creating for many of these stressor receptor interactions. So we have a series of strategies we've been following, which you've heard about today. The first is to ensure that we publicly share all the available information. And our TETHIS website has the information you've seen today and a lot more. And I also just want to point out that Primer is actually a US, if you will, data and information ecosystem that includes TETHIS. We have produced a number of other data portals and data bases that are all interactive. So you can go into the center of Primer, put in some keywords, find the actual data, find the appropriate webinars, find the appropriate papers, etc., software, And there's a geographic information system that displays the OES information for projects around the world. Although it's a US based system, much of the content is actually international. So that we think this is incredibly key, make the same, I'm sure everyone has the same information. We've been trying to share best practices and avoiding minimizing harm, which is the management measures tool that Michaela briefly showed you. This is collected again from around the world with the help of all our partners. We are systematically using data collected at next, you can click that one. Systematically using data that's collected at one site to help consent future sites. And that's the data transferability and risk retirement that Michaela's gone through. We are trying to make science accessible for regulatory use, the next one, through the guidance documents and the monitoring matrix that Michaela again briefly went through. And we are trying to look forward to what's coming next. And that is the systems approach. When we think about cumulative effects, ecosystem effects, and also scaling up from small numbers of devices up to commercial arrays, we're trying to think about what are the regulatory hurdles coming over the horizon that we can begin to look at. There are, I know, some European regulations coming in around cumulative effects and ecosystems. We don't have them in the US yet, but we will. So that's where we're really trying to understand how we position ourselves and the research community globally to do what is needed. But I think one of the sort of true outcomes that we've seen throughout this, if you want to click one more time, is the real need to engage with all the stakeholders, the developers, the researchers, the regulatory community, and others, engage with them all the time and make sure that all the results really are accessible to everyone. This is not a time for the industry to be terribly competitive with one another, but rather to collaborate and cooperate in order to move forward. Okay, next slide, please. So that's it. Michaela and I are up here, but this is the work of many, many that we are presenting. We have a very broad and talented team at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. And I want to acknowledge the 16 representatives of the countries that we work with. We could not possibly do this without having input from all of them. They work to provide us information. They are really, really good sounding boards for many of the ideas we come up with, good ones and bad ones. And also, they do provide, in many cases, they have taken the leads on the white papers and producing other OESE material, including the state of the science. Okay, so that's it. Last slide. I want to thank you very much for listening to us today. There's our emails. We're always interested in hearing from people, and tethys.pnnl.gov. You can always find us and all the information there. And with that, I'd love to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea, and thank you, Michaela, for a fantastic presentation. I have many questions myself. I see that questions are coming in the Q&A box as well, so make sure to type them in. We still have 15 minutes to go through them. And I also enabled the webinar chat, so if you want to share your own experiences with ocean energy consenting or the use of these different concepts, make sure to write them in the chat. So I'm starting with the first question here, just reading it out loud. While completely retiring risk is a worthwhile end goal, there is inevitable uncertainty on ecological impacts. Are there quantitative frameworks recommended by Tethys to estimate deaths or disturbance on species, such as required for potential biological removal by the US Marine Mammal Protection Act?
I'll take a first swing at that. Thanks, Ben. It's a really good question. And it's a tough question. We do not yet have the quantitative frameworks that will really satisfy the modeling that is needed for the things like the US Marine Mammal Protection Act and for the European audience, in addition to our Endangered Species Act, which is similar to species at risk and other kinds of acts like that in other countries. We have a particular protection for marine mammals writ large. It may not have been the best legislation ever created because it does create frankly, some conflicts between species, but there is this need to understand whether a marine mammal population is likely to enter into a so-called jeopardy situation where they can no longer maintain themselves. In order to carry out this work, the cognizant agency, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, does model what this potential biological removal will be. This is a really tricky one because collision risk with tidal turbines is the biggest concern there. And you will note when Michaela went through and talked about what we've been retiring, collision risk is not in there, partly because we just don't have enough data. We're trying to prove something will not happen. Animals will not be hit. That's terribly difficult to do. However, I think what we are working towards is getting some sense, if not truly quantitative, a semi-quantitative answer. And there's a group of us working on a paper on this right now. How can we begin to think about all the probabilities that need to happen? The animals need to be present. They need to be at the appropriate depth. They need to be, even if a animal goes through the rotor area of a turbine, the blade is not in the same place at all times. It's not a solid wall they're going through. So we can begin to put some, numbers on this, and we're going to try to do that. Problem being, of course, it's very species specific, probably turbine specific, etc. So Ben, the answer is no, we don't have those yet. However, considering we started a while ago with regulators feeling every animal that was near a tidal turbine was at risk for death, strong risk for death, we think we are making progress towards understanding how small that risk really is. So not a satisfactory answer, but that's kind of where I think everybody's going at this point.
Thank you very much, Andrea, for that. I will just ask a few questions about the risk retirement approach. So do you know if this approach is being used in any other sector, any renewables, wind industry, or any other?
I'll start on that, and then Michaela, you can jump in on that one. We've worked on offshore wind considerably. We're not doing as much of that anymore, and introducing some of these same concepts. And they've been picked up, certainly the stressor receptor relationship. And as many of you may know, wind is a much older industry coming from land. And many of the probability and encounter risk models, or collision risk and encounter risk models, come out of the wind sector. We have found they are not entirely appropriate, to be honest, and need a good deal of tweaking. But there is considerable feedback, I think, between the two industries beginning to look at this. And I think where we've had some influence on wind is, if not talking risk retirement, talking about the stressor receptors and really trying to get everything down to risk. What is the probability of a bad outcome? What is the consequence of it were to occur? So we're having some convergence, I think, of language and concepts. When it comes to floating wind, which we're out on the Pacific coast, and we have such a narrow continental shelf that floating wind is really what's going to happen here, as it will in many of the deeper waters around Europe and elsewhere. There is much more commonality between wave and tidal devices and floating wind, really, than there is with bottom-based wind, because of the floating platforms, the cables, etc. So I think we're starting to see some convergence there, but not entirely. And I think we have to acknowledge that some of these concepts really have come out of oil and gas as well. So we like to think, with a new industry like marine energy, maybe we can take the best from a number of these and move this forward efficiently. What do you think, Michaela? You've been working on wind a little more than I have recently.
Yeah, I've been working more on the community engagement side, so not as much on risk retirement, but I definitely agree with everything you've been saying. And a lot of the examples do come from oil and gas. When we've been talking with folks at international workshops in Australia and other places, we have really great examples of where a risk has been retired. And it might not always be that same phrase, that same language. So sometimes that can be challenging to gather examples from other industry, because you say, has risk retirement happened? And everyone's like, no. But then you describe it and people are like, oh, well, we've taken a risk off the table in consenting processes, or some other phrasing that has kind of that same meaning and really the same impact to it. And so kind of what I've been working on, and as we move towards the 2024 State of the Science, is trying to gather those examples where it's risk retirement has happened, whatever that means for, whether it's, as Andrea presented, taking the collision risk for fish off the table or retiring that for the deployment in the US. But really it's going to be learning by talking with people and learning from experiences and examples. These aren't often well documented in documents or the literature. So I'll just add that that's been like a particular challenge to find where these have been happening, but it really helps to talk to people. So as Andrea said, if anyone has experiences or good practices, lessons learned to share, we absolutely would love to hear from you.
Thank you.
And one quick other note, Lotta, we're starting to really think recently a lot about use of ocean space. And as we are obviously getting many of these new renewables proposed offshore, there's already existing users, but we are seeing between offshore wind, marine renewables, and also subsea cables, things like telecom and power cables, there really is some commonality in how we need to go about consenting them. Because we need to be thinking about the use of ocean space. And obviously the cables have a great deal to do both with export cables for wind or wave or tidal, but also disturbance of seafloor, etc. So the more we can see these different industries sort of collaborate on how we address the consenting processes, because right now it's not easy being a regulator or an advisor. There's a lot of new things coming at them very, very quickly, and there's a lot of potential conflicts. So,
Great, thank you. I can only agree with what you both of you said, and I think highlighting those examples to show that this has been done, that's really valuable in this growing sector. I think, Michaela, you mentioned this, but if you could explain a little bit better so I understand. So for example, for the 4 retired risks, how would this change the permitting process of a project? Would that mean that the environmental impact assessment is easier, or you do less monitoring, or what does the project developer need to do if the risk is retired?
Yeah, great question. So I'll just start by saying that is always up to whoever the regulator is on that project. So what we're trying to provide is that guidance to where we think we are with that risk for those small numbers of devices, so 1 to 4 devices. We hope that the guidance documents, so for example, there's an underwater noise stressor specific guidance document. And within that, we detail information about the risk. We detail what we know currently, some examples of noise levels from different deployments, from operational devices, and we point to additional information. And we also say why we think we're at some level of agreement of why underwater noise can be retired for those small numbers of devices. So we hope that that can be seen by a regulator or advisor, by a developer, and then brought into that consenting process and inform that with the information available and everything. We hope that that lessens the monitoring or the long timelines for consenting, but again, it's up to that regulator and what they decide. And especially as this underwater noise example, you'll always need to understand what the operational noise level of a device is. So once you have that understanding, you can look at it. In the US, we do have noise thresholds. And so for us, we tried to look at those thresholds, and all of the operational devices that we have information for have fallen below those thresholds, which is a really good example of why we think we can retire this risk, and using that information from previous or current developments and using those to inform those new developments. So that's really what we're hoping to do. Again, just provide that information, provide accessible data, and inform the process for the regulators to decide what's needed for that country, for that jurisdiction.
Absolutely right on, Michaela. I think the other thing to note is we have heard around all the countries with this, real increase of offshore renewables applications for consenting. There are many, many new regulators being brought on board, regulators and advisors. And these people have no possibility of having a background in this. So the chances are they really have to learn from the beginning. And we've tried to be very responsive to this. With these processes that Michaela has noted, we have also produced some educational or whatever you want to call it, materials that try to give a quick a way of getting into this for new regulators. And we've seen that uptake by several countries where they want to provide, we've called it a brochure. It's about a 24-page, highly illustrated version of this is what marine energy is. And here's some examples of the specific environmental interactions that have happened at projects and how they've been resolved. So that I think is really key too. We cannot dismiss how much pressure is being put on these regulatory agencies and processes and regulators.
And I'll just note, if anyone's interested in that brochure, you can go to the TETHIS website and just search for brochure and it will pop up right there. So that's available in an interactive online version as well as a printable version. And we do hope that really helps. A lot of countries, we're seeing really great turnover of regulators. So as Andrew mentioned, key to our process is sharing information, results, tools, and that's really challenging to do when regulators, you're getting new regulators in every like 2 or 3 years in some countries. So we hope this brochure can really aid in those circumstances.
Great, thank you. A kind of a follow-up question, or that made me think. So if, for example, in your examples of the different use of risk retirement or adaptive management, so this, for the regulator, they don't actually need to write new laws or new regulations. They can just take that information and apply it in their existing work. It doesn't necessarily mean updating some of the underlying regulations that they have. Is that correct?
I think that's absolutely right, Lotta. Regulators aren't in the position, they may not like regulations they have to apply, or they wish they had more, but they're not really in that position. One of the other key, I think, audiences, I'll get back to that question in a sec, but one of the other key audiences, I think, is the policy level, whether they are decision makers all the way up through those who are actually creating laws and regulations. And we have tried to create a series of sort of derivative products from the state of the science, like a 2-page, you need to understand a little bit about electromagnetic fields or changes in habitat. So we're really hoping to sort of educate at that level as well, so that there is an understanding of what regulations might or might not do as they create them. As far as being able to apply these examples directly, we certainly hope so. And at a very practical level, if nothing else, the developer should have this information at his or her fingertips. When they first sit down with the regulator, the appropriate regulator, they can have this discussion. And that may be where the guidance documents are most useful. We are not in any position and should not be trying to explain to a regulator how to do their job, but rather here are some tools that you can have those productive conversations about. And as a regulator may bring up an issue in a particular area, if there is information there and the developer is well aware of it for his or her device, there is this opportunity to really move the process along. So that is our hope, that these examples, if they're not taken sort of wholesale into an EIS, an EIA, then they could in fact inform. And the hope is that it will lessen these burdens all along, particularly as Michaela said. For example, many consenting processes require a couple of years of baseline data first and then some years of monitoring data. If we can simply shrink some of that, that will both accelerate the time to consenting, but it will also decrease costs in this emerging industry.
Great, thank you. I think we have about 1 minute left, so I just wanted to quickly touch upon the data transferability. So there's a lot of talk about this, at least in the sector now, but what do you see as the main kind of challenges? Why is it not happening as we were trying to?
Not enough data.
Okay.
and when Michaela mentioned this matrix we've put together, this is really we have the backbone, the framework. We don't have enough devices in the water with enough data sets. I think we're starting to see it. That's why I noted what SME did. It happened to be their own turbine, and they went from one place to another. They were diligent about collecting data initially. One of the things we've tried to agitate about very strongly is every time a device goes in the water, a pilot, a demonstration, a commercial device, whether required or not, taking some environmental data will help add to this. And we're starting to see this be really pushed in the US and I think other places too. It's understandable. The developer is under pressure to get the device in the water at some scale, to test it, to get the performance data, get it out, not lose anything. But the opportunity cost there of not collecting data around every one of those. We do have documentation, our so-called metadata forms on TETHIS for every device we can find that's ever been in the water for which environmental data have been collected. We don't want to lose that information, and this is the database that is going to allow us to do more of this. I think we just don't have enough, and we have to, you really do have to compare like to like, and there just aren't enough of them yet. Michaela, what do you think?
Yeah, I was gonna mention just the comparability of data. And so we did try and do that in, I think it's available in the 2020 State of the Science report in the data transferability risk retirement chapter, where we have a bit of a data collection consistency table, where we try and make some recommendations of what data to be collected, how, which types of instrumentation. And then we do have another project here at Pacific Northwest National Lab called Triton that's trying to take that information and test how to measure that data. And so really collecting data that's comparable across the industry so that you can take all of these different projects that are entering the water and actually compare them across the board. That is really key to being able to transfer data. And as Andrew said, compare like to like and learn between them.
Great, thank you. And I think the European Commission has really identified this issue as well, and the need to collect and share the data. So as an example, the Horizon Europe, which is the research and innovation funding program in the EU, they will fund 4 pilot farms in the next couple of years, 2 for tidal, 2 for wave. And as one requirement is to have an environmental monitoring plan in place and share that data as well. So there we will hopefully get some really good, valuable data of those pilot farms as well.
I'm trying to type in primer and I've typed it wrong twice now. Sorry about that. I'd also like to point out that under primer, which is the third one I've typed there, primer.org, we have held 3 international data sharing workshops over the last 3 years. And there are reports up there getting together with other data administrators, et cetera. Thank you, Lisa. Really talk about the values of data sharing, the barriers to data sharing, and really encouraging this sort of open access and data format so you can transfer data back and forth. And so if you have an interest in that, go to the one that Lisel typed, not the one I did, ones I did, and you'll be able to find those international data sharing reports. And I think there's some useful information there that really is trying to get at this and make sure that we do have these databases and portals around the world that are complementary. But Michaela's right. It all comes back to what data do you take when you're out there on the water? And if it's comparable, it should go a long way towards, again, providing confidence to the regulators that we can transfer data.
Thank you very much. We're a bit over time, but I think this is a good moment to wrap up. So thanks again for your presentation, and thank you to all the attendees. This recording will be on the Egypt Ocean website, as well as the presentation slides, so you can view them there in a couple of days, and hope to see you in our next webinar. Thanks again, and have a nice rest of the day. Bye.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.